Last week kind of made our transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. We looked at the New Testament world, kind of some things that made it where I think and some other scholars think the circumstances that made it possible for Jesus to come when he did. Not necessarily possible, but that made it plausible. You know, these circumstances made it a good time. This is what the fullness of time looked like. And as we study the New Testament from a historical perspective, that's really what we're looking at. But on top of that, if we lived 1,000 years in the future and we were going to write a high school research paper on the year 2020, where would we start? I mean, we probably wouldn't start with the daily lives of people like us. We'd probably start with the government and understand what's going on in the government, especially in a year like 2020, where you have pandemics and threats of wars and other stuff, elections and whatnot. That's a good place to start. And so when we look at what goes on in the Bible, in the New Testament, I think we need to remember that this isn't a separate part from history. I mean, it's happening right in history. And some of the first things you come to in the Gospels, like the census and Herod and other things, that's right in the middle of governmental history. And so we're going to look at the Roman emperors. I think we will probably just get to Augustus because I want to talk today about the fall of the Roman Republic. We will go to Domitian. Domitian dies circa 97 AD, and so that should cover for us the first century relatively, at least from Jesus to the writing of the book of Revelation in the 90s, give or take. So as we think about Rome, we need to remember that Rome was not always an imperial power. Rome did not always have an emperor. When Rome was founded, it was founded as a monarchy. And, we're talking way BC now, and it's kind of hard to think about, but Rome comes in three stages. You have the Roman monarchy, the Roman Republic, and then imperial Rome. And each one of those will have their rise and fall. So Rome begins, the legend goes that it's formed by Romulus. Romulus and Remus are the brothers who are raised by the wolf, and you may not be familiar with that legend, but it's an interesting legend to say the least. But that's why Rome is named Rome, because they say that Romulus founded it. And so Rome is going to have this hierarchy. The Roman Republic then is formed around 495 BC. That gives us approximately 500 years, not quite, 450 I guess, but 500 years where the Roman Republic is the governing authority in Rome. Tarquin the Proud is overthrown by the people. Tarquin the Proud is the last king of Rome, and he lives up to his name. He's a tyrant king, and he doesn't really provide for the people the way that he should, but he's overthrown by the people. The people say they want to have their own voice. They want to give rule to the people. And so ultimately you form the Republic, and the Republic is formed of two basic groups. You have the senators and you have the popular voice. The senators are made up of this, the senators are formed by the wealthy, right? And just the same as it is today. I mean, whether we want to believe that or not, that's the way it is. If you have money, you're involved in government. And the same is true for them. You had to own so much land and have so much money in order to be a senator. And then you had the popular vote, where in theory, all the people would come together and they would cast their votes for whatever legislation there was. So in the same way that America has the three branches of government, Rome had three branches of government. You had the Senate, the popular voice, and the consuls. And I think I mentioned this last week, that you have two consuls who rule together, one from the senatorial class and one from the popular class. And so when legislation actually made it through both of them, chances are it was pretty good legislation because it was going to benefit both the rich and the poor. The Republic, or the Senate, could have sole rule. In other words, they could appoint someone to be a dictator. So in times of trouble and in times of war, they could appoint one person to be the sole authority of Rome. And that's what Julius Caesar becomes. He becomes dictator, but we'll get to him in just a little bit. The dictatorship was usually lasted for a period of about 6 months to a year. And so this was not something that was to be a prolonged thing, and the person who had the dictatorship would willingly give it up, because no one really wanted it. If you were going to be a dictator, that implied that times were pretty bad, you see. So contrast that then with Julius Caesar, which again we'll talk about later, but Julius Caesar was dictator for 5 years. 5 years versus 6 months, pretty good time difference. All right, so as we said, dictator would then give up his position willingly. So why did the republic fall? I mean, that sounds like a pretty good model for government. And by the way, America is a republic. We say in our Pledge of Allegiance, and to the republic for which it stands. This is a misconception among people my generation and younger. They believe that we live in a democracy. We do not. Greece was a democracy. Rome was a republic. We are modeled after Rome because our founding fathers read the Roman classics. So why did the republic fall? The republic fell for the same reasons that every other world power has fallen, and if we're not careful, not trying to be a prophet or the son of a prophet, but if we're not careful, America will fall right into that as well. You can classify these into two big reasons, or two big categories, just as you can with every other fall. They fall for economic reasons and political reasons. Now, don't worry about writing all that down because we're going to have this on separate slides. We'll talk about each one individually, okay? Just know right now that there are economic reasons and political reasons in those two categories. So when you begin thinking about Rome in the fall of the Republic, what really leads the Republic to fall is the war between Rome, which is the top red dot here, and what's circled here is the Roman Empire at this particular time of the Punic Wars, which is between Rome and Carthage, which is this lower red dot, and Carthage Empire is this circle. So relatively small in the grand scheme of what will become the Roman Empire as they circle the Mediterranean Sea. That was actually genius of them to conquer the coastline, because when you do that, you control commerce, right? So very genius of them. So you have 3 Punic Wars where Hannibal of Carthage is trying to move into Roman territory, and Rome is trying to also expand. So in some cases, for example, World War I and World War II, wars can unite and prosper countries. World War I and World War II were relatively beneficial for America as far as economics goes. When World War II ended, America ended a pretty good state of economy, right? So what happens then when this war is ended? The exact opposite happens, okay? When Hannibal, who is the general of Carthage, ransacked the land outside of Rome, he drove out its inhabitants. So picture this. You're not in Rome, you're outside of Rome, you are a tenant farmer or you own the land, you are self-sustaining, you're taking care of yourself, you're farming, and then in comes an invading force and they take your land and they either sell you into slavery or they kick you off your land. Okay, so what does that do for the Roman economy? Well, now there's land that's not being used, but so Rome is going to come in and take the land over. Remember, because Rome beats Carthage in this Punic War. So when Rome defeats the Carthaginians, the Romans took this land back, but instead of giving it to these families, they make it public land. And they farm it with slave labor. We'll talk about slave labor on the next slide, so I'll try not to get too much into that. By this time, because of the wars and of all the things that have happened there, about 60% of Rome's urban population was slave ancestry. So I've heard it said before, I'm not entirely sure if this is true, I've heard it said multiple times though, that 1 out of every 3 people in Rome was a slave. Okay, so just think about that. Now, you've probably heard this before in your own Bible studies as books like Philemon and the Gospels talk about slavery and talk about it quite candidly. Slavery in the first century was vastly different than slavery in American history. I think we know that. We'll have a whole class period on slavery, by the way, towards the end of our time together. But this much slave population really gives the threat of an uprising. And so the Romans were actually geniuses with this. Because in ancient Rome, slavery was not a matter of race or culture or skin color or ethnicity or anything like that. Two main ways to become a slave. Number one, you were captured in war, or number two, you were born into slavery. Now, you could sell yourself or your family into slavery, but that wasn't as popular as people like to make it sound. So those two ways were the most popular, captured in war or born into slavery. So think about this. If you capture, well, I'll tell you what, let me just go on to the next slide. Basically, from this slide, all we need to know is that Hannibal kicks people out of their land, and when Rome comes back and conquers it, they take this land, and instead of giving it back to their people, they make it public land. By the way, this is a very communistic idea, is it not? Of having government-run farms. Very communistic, okay? So here's the influx of slaves and migrants. So after the Punic Wars, 250,000 Carthaginians were captured and sold into slavery in Italy. That's a lot of slaves. A lot of slaves. And what this does then is it puts the tenant farmers that we were talking about, it puts them out of work because now they don't even have their land to farm, and even if they did, slave labor is cheaper. So if you're a Roman citizen, even in the Republic, your sole duty to Rome is to fight in the military. Well, there were times where Rome was not an expansive empire, and so you could go and you could fight for a month or two, and then you could return home in time for harvest, and everything was fine, so long as you didn't die. Well, now Rome is expanding, the empire is expanding. You're moving further and further away from home, and so the slave labor is going to take your farm over, right? So this puts tenant farmers out of work. I don't want to get so political with this, but I think that a simple study of ancient Rome will enlighten us to our world today, especially in America. Rome was rightly called Babylon in the book of Revelation, right? I think today we could rightly call America Rome. We live in the exact same way. So people say, well, why is illegal immigration such a big problem? Well, you know, the stereotypical answer, the go-to answer is they're taking American jobs. Oh yeah, but they're taking American jobs that nobody wants to do. It doesn't matter. Because if you take jobs from citizens from being illegal, you wreck the economy that way. Okay? Now, I'm all for people working for a living, but when you look at economy and economic reasons, that's one of the big ones here. Not only do you have the cheap labor and the free labor, but you have a rise in sanitation issues. The more people you have, the less sanitary things get. And at risk of being so grotesque, you know, how do you get rid of human waste in the ancient world? Well, it doesn't really change until Augustus brings in the aqueducts into Rome, and that's even for really good infrastructure, and not all of Rome had that. It basically stays the same way until the Dark Ages. And that is, you take a bucket and you throw it out the window into the street. The streets are sloped on both sides, and the excrement goes in the middle. That will hopefully be washed away by the rain. And when you're walking on the street, you just don't walk in the middle. You walk up on the edges, right? Well, what comes with having human and animal waste in the streets? Disease, bugs, horrible things. So when you have 250,000 slaves coming into Rome, that's 250,000 more people. I can't imagine what that must have been like. We talked a little bit ago about the conditions making the revolt a constant threat. Like I said, I've heard it said 1 out of every 3 Romans, or people in Rome, I should say, were a slave. For our purposes, let's just assume that's true. You may know more about slave revolts than I do, like Spartacus and others, but if 1 out of every 3 is a Roman, the Romans were geniuses because you didn't know who was a slave and who wasn't. I mean, the slaves look like you, they talk like you, they act like you, they have families like you. You don't have a clue who's a slave and who's not. And the Romans did that on purpose because if you did know, there would be an uprising. It's amazing, in my opinion, that in American history, we did not have more slave uprisings on a massive scale than we did. It's a great study in psychology, and a terrible, terrible thing that happened, but still an amazing study in psychology. So the constant threat of revolt was very real based on these slaves and migrants. This is still under economic reasons, and this will be the last economic reason before we get into political reasons, but you have the reforms of Tiberius Gracchus. Now, what Tiberius Gracchus wants to do sounds like a good idea, okay? But I call Tiberius Gracchus, when I'm teaching this to my students, I tell them, remember Tiberius Gracchus as Bernie Sanders of ancient Rome. And I don't care how you feel about him or whatever, but their ideologies are virtually the same. Take from the rich, give to the poor. And it's a overly romanticized Robin Hood, but when you do that, you ruin your economy, right? And again, not trying to be political, just trying to be objective here when we talk about this. So Tiberius Gracchus argued that land acquired by war should be given to the poor. So what was happening with the land acquired by war? They were putting slaves on it to work, and the government owned it. So that's a communist idea, right? Where the government owns farms and the government provides you with everything you need. Socialism, on the other hand, says everyone should be provided for equally. Everything should be given to you, because to a socialist, it is a good idea where if you are poor, let me provide you with housing and a way to make a living and free phones and free food and a free car and whatever else. That is a great thought in theory, where you say, well, as you work a job, now you will be able to save that money and get yourself out of the situation of being poor that you're in. But what happens? These people do not, and I'm not trying to be political, I can't stress that enough, but when you're given things, you just want to continue to nurse the cow, right? To keep milking the cash cow. And you don't want to get out of that situation because that's work. Well, the same thing would happen here. If you give them land, they're not going to get themselves out of that. They're going to keep relying on you for things. So that's what he wanted to do. Now, the problem with that is the concilium plebis, or the popular assembly, passed the measure. Well, of course they did, because they're poor. But the Senate disagreed with that, and they didn't want that. And so the Senate becomes very angry, and eventually they provoke riots and kill Tiberius Gracchus. So those are the economic reasons. When, I think to summarize, it doesn't matter what government you have. When the government wants to take over and wants to start controlling everything or providing for everyone, your economy will fail. It's proven historical over and over and over and over and over again. Right? No example of communism or socialism has ever been a success in the history of our world. And that started back at the Republic of Rome. So let's talk about some of the political reasons. You have two groups, the optimates and the populares. The optimates, which is where we get our word optimum, the best, they are the very wealthy. They are the generals and the significant in society. Now, don't be confused, because the optimates and the populares were both very wealthy. Okay? But the optimates wanted power in the Senate. And so if they had power in the Senate, they would have control. For the remainder of our study of Roman government, you only really need to know 4 words. All right? So don't miss this. Romans, don't share power. Romans don't share power. Every time we talk about an emperor who gets assassinated, guess why? Because there was a time where they tried to share power, and Romans don't share power. Right? So the optimates, they wanted the power. The populares wanted to give a voice to the common people. I think here you kind of see a little bit, to some degree, the feud of Republican and Democrat. And I don't want to push that too far. Just as a way of illusion, one group emphasizes capitalism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and limited government and all of that, and the electoral college and whatnot. And the other group says, no, every single person should have a vote. We should do away with the electoral college and whatnot. Well, that's kind of what you have going on here. So the formation of these two groups and how they're fighting constantly like cats and dogs for what's going to be best for Rome, well, what ultimately happens? Rome gets divided, and a house divided cannot stand. The same is true with America today. Each group is fussing and fighting over what's best for America when in reality, they're tearing America apart. So I think America could rightly be called Rome, as I mentioned earlier. So what happens? The Senate, the Republic, is in shambles, and now there's need for a dictator. There's need for a one person or a group of people to take the stand and to get Rome back on track. And so what you find in the 1st century BC is these strong men, these political strong men who rise to power. Of these, at least one of them is known to you, Julius Caesar, of course, Gaius Julius Caesar. The others maybe not so much. Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, we'll call him Sulla. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey. Marcus Licinius Crassus, we'll call him Crassus. These are your political strong men in the 1st century BC. Now, Sulla is going to predate a little bit. There will be some overlap with these other three, but he's kind of out of the mix. Sulla becomes dictator by defeating Mithridates of Pontus and obviously asserting his power there. And one more thing about these guys here. You have a national military, but you also, if you're very wealthy, you have your own military. And so what we're going to find is that these three men, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, put their militaries together to be the strong triumvirate. And then, of course, Romans don't share power. And so their militaries begin fighting against each other. So Crassus and Pompey begin the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar, but Crassus and Pompey don't get along. As a matter of fact, they hate each other. Now, here's what is so fascinating about Julius Caesar. Every preacher should study Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar was able to take people who absolutely hated each other and get them to work together. He was a charismatic person. He could read people. He was eccentric. He was just a fascinating person. There's a story, I suppose it's a true story, it's in several ancient authors, of Julius Caesar being captured by pirates, and they held him for ransom, and finally the ransom comes, and Caesar says, when I get out of here, I'm going to come back and I'm going to crucify every one of you. And he said it jokingly, or so they thought. Well, not a day goes by and he returns to crucify them, and he crucifies every one of them after he's been let go. So he has a way of telling horrible things in a way where you're like, oh, tell me again. I don't know if I can get away with saying this. I'm going to say it anyways. He has a way of telling you that you're going to go to hell and enjoy the ride. So that's the character of Julius Caesar. That's why he was able to stay in power for so long, because people just loved him. Julius, one thing that I didn't put on here, I didn't have room. Julius gave his daughter Junia to Pompey to be his wife. Junia would have been about 14, 15 years old. Pompey would have been about in his 40s or 50s. And we think, well, that's probably something she didn't want. She probably didn't want to do that. As a matter of fact, it seems that she did want to do that. She seems very excited about this relationship, and from all accounts we can basically infer that she and Pompey lived a very happy and loving life together. And so Julius was able to look at situations, see what they needed, and work within them. We're skipping over the civil wars between the breaking of the first triumvirate. There's no real need to go into that, other than to say that Julius Caesar was appointed as sole dictator in 48 BC with Mark Antony as his second in command. So when Caesar becomes dictator, as we said, a dictator holds power for approximately 6 months. He's in power for 5 years. In those 5 years, he takes a weak and fragmented government that was wrecked, both politically and economically, as we discussed, and he builds it back together in just a very short amount of time. It's almost like, again, trying to be objective as possible here, but it's almost like looking at someone like Donald Trump or another president and being really objective and saying, what has this particular person accomplished in the 4 years of their presidency? Some presidents, not so much. They act like they have, but not really. Other presidents, it seems like they haven't really done anything until you start listing their accomplishments that no one knew about, and it just blows you out of the water. Well, Julius Caesar was the same way. He was constantly working within his time as a dictator. Now, that's not to make him a good guy. He was power hungry, and of course the Senate knew that, and they ultimately plotted to kill him, which you are all aware of. But one thing that he did that he doesn't really get a lot of praise for, he gets a lot of praise for rebuilding Rome. It's during the time of Julius Caesar and later on his adopted son Augustus that infrastructure and the great buildings and all of that come into Rome. But Julius Caesar regulated grain sales and taxes as well as the purchases of luxury items. So, for our purposes of Bible study, I know this is approximately 40, 50 years after Julius Caesar is in power, but just go with me on this. Because when legislation is presented, it's usually not nullified, right? Lydia and Philemon, two of my favorite characters in the New Testament. What's Lydia's job? Do you remember? That's right. Yep, she is a seller of purple. What's significant about purple? Right. Purple is a luxury item. It's reserved for the royal. The dye to make purple is very expensive, and so naturally the product is going to be very expensive. So when we read about Lydia, we infer that she's a wealthy woman, right? Why do we infer that? Is it because she is a maker of purple and purple is reserved for the wealthy? Well, even so, that could be taxed ridiculously, but it wasn't. Why? Because of Julius Caesar's tax regulations on luxury items. She was able to retain that money. In the same way, what about Philemon? Philemon is often understood to be a wealthy individual. Why do we think he's a wealthy individual? Well, some of us would say it's because he has slaves. Well, that can't be true because Jesus tells us a parable of a slave who owns a slave. So just the mere presence of slaves doesn't necessarily dictate that someone's wealthy. But in Philemon, verse 2, Paul says that he's writing the letter to Philemon, Apphia, Archippus, and the church who is in your house. So if Philemon has a congregation meeting in his house, and I don't know if there's 3 of them, if there's 10 of them, or if there's 100 of them, I don't know. But what do we know about ancient house churches in the first century? Well, they shared a meal together every week. Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians calls it a love feast. Okay? So they share a meal together, and during that meal they have the Lord's Supper. That's why 1 Corinthians 11, you have the confusion about the Lord's Supper there. He had to have some kind of wealth in order to provide food for the church every week. It doesn't matter if there's 3 people or if there's 300 people. You got to have some kind of wealth. And he probably had to have land. And Colossae was a Roman province that was given to military leaders to retire on. They were given land to retire and so on. And so Philemon could have been a military leader. We don't know. But he has some form of means to do this. Well, you go back to Julius Caesar and his regulation on grain sales. If Philemon, we know he has slaves, and we know he has a house big enough to hold a church, and we know that he feeds the church every week, so I tend to think that he is a wealthy farmer. I think he's a retired military officer, but I think in his retirement he farms. Well, how is he able to keep all that money? Goes back to Julius Caesar and the grain regulations. So, just for our purposes, there's 2 examples of how this is significant. Julius Caesar is the first to retire military veterans. It's not until Julius Caesar that retirement is even a thing. Okay, so Julius Caesar introduces the idea of retirement, and he gives them land. Colossae and Philippi are 2 of the most popular, not during the time of Julius Caesar, but later on, where these military officers would be retired. So when we read, for example, Paul's letter to the Philippians, we need to read that understanding that the majority of people, I think there are Jewish people in that congregation, of course, but the majority of people reading that are going to be Gentiles. And they're going to be former military. One thing that Julius Caesar did that we use today is he employed what we call the Julian calendar, a 365-day solar calendar with 1 extra day every 4 years. We call that leap year. But we do not use the Julian calendar that he came up with. His was still off, and ours is a reformed version of that. But we can thank him for beginning that process. Julius Caesar, of course, was assassinated by the 60 senators led by Brutus and Cassius because they saw him as a political tyrant, one who was power hungry, one who was unwilling to give up the dictatorship, and they murder him. So there is a picture of dear old Julius Caesar on the left, and Mark Antony is on the right. It's amazing. I'm not an artist by any means, and I'm not an art student by any means. But when you study ancient history, a lot of what you have to study is architecture and art. And how people are depicted in art and architecture really gives you a glimpse into what the people of that time thought of their leaders. I think here's a good example with Julius Caesar and with Mark Antony. You get this really good-looking, kind of stoic-looking face, and they have a tight jawbone. You know, that they're very manly. And we also noticed, as we mentioned last week, these men are always depicted with shaved faces, which means that they take pride in themselves and their image. And, we'll contrast that with Nero a little bit later as we talk about the emperors. So Julius Caesar is dead. He's been killed. The logical question to ask is who should take over now? Well, we would expect Mark Antony to take over because he was second in command. However, Mark Antony ain't nowhere to be found. Because if someone stabs your boss in the back, you're probably going to run away too. So Mark Antony flees Rome thinking that he was going to be assassinated. However, no other murders were reported. And this is interesting because as we move into the emperorship, into imperial Rome, usually when there's one assassination, it's followed by others. So I think Mark Antony had the right idea here. But no other murders were reported, so Antony decides he's going to come back to Rome and he's going to kill all the conspirators. Now, before he died, Caesar had named Octavian, who was his 18-year-old nephew, and as his successor. Julius Caesar not only I say nephew on the slide, is actually his great-nephew, but he not only had that blood relation to Octavian, but Caesar had adopted him. And the adoption in that time and in the Roman world is the exact same as it is today. If you're adopted, you are forevermore the child of that person who adopted you. Right? I'm working with a professor this semester, and I met with him yesterday, and he informed me he was a missionary in Africa for a long time before he started teaching at Faulkner, and he informed me that he has 10 children, 2 sets of twins, and 4 adopted children from Africa, and then of course others to make 10, but the 2 sets of twins really stuck out in my mind, and the 4 adopted from Africa. And they may look different than his biological children, but they are his children. He will always refer to them as his children. They are not my adopted children. They're not my pets. They are my children. The same was true in the first century. And Julius Caesar, he had his daughter Junia. I don't think he had any male children. And what we're going to find with the emperors is having children for them is very difficult. A lot of that goes back to them having ancestral relationships, but having children, especially having male children, was very difficult for them. So Octavian then is a successor, and the second triumvirate is formed with Mark Antony, Octavian, and a guy by the name of Lepidus, which he really doesn't do anything. It's more Octavian and Mark Antony. So the second triumvirate then, in 33 BC, Octavian and Antony launched campaigns against each other. Again, what are our 4 words? Romans don't share power. Same is true with Octavian and Antony. So they begin fighting each other. A year later, in 32 BC, the Senate declares war on Cleopatra. Interestingly, they don't declare war on Antony. One important note here that links these two together is that Antony had fled to Egypt to be with Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra was a little promiscuous, shall we say, because she had had a romantic relationship with Julius Caesar. And now she has a romantic relationship with Mark Antony. And so the Senate declares war on Cleopatra, who is, of course, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra and Antony then are boxed in, and they both commit suicide in 31 BC. So now competition is annihilated, and we get the rise of Octavian/Augustus. He takes power in 27 BC, and he does not die until 14 AD. That's going to be very important. I don't know if I have this on. Yeah, I do. Okay. Augustus is quoted as saying, "I found Rome a brick and left it a city of marble." When you look at archaeological artifacts from Rome, from before Augustus to during his reign, that's exactly right. I think when he says it, he's being a little more allegorical here, saying that I found Rome in shambles and I was able to make it the great superpower that it is. That's true, but he had a pretty good foundation for doing that from Julius Caesar. But when you look at the architecture, Rome was largely a brick city. It was made out of clay, and he brings in marble, and he institutes all these great buildings. You know, the what's it called in Rome, where they had their meetings, where the Senate had their meetings. You can Google it. You can Google it. It still stands today, but that came during his time. Yes. Thank you. He does something that kind of reminds us of Tiberius Gracchus, but the difference is he doesn't do it from the funds of the government, he does it from his own pocket. He gives his soldiers money, and he gives the plebs money. Plebs is another word for the common people. Now you have by the time Augustus gets in power, you still have 2 groups of people, but they're called the patricians, the upper people, and the plebs, or the plebeians, are the common people. So he does this from his own money. I find it interesting when non-biblical people do biblical things. What does the Lord tell the church to do? Take care of each other. That's what you find the church doing when it first starts in Acts chapter 2, right? They had all things in common. That's not a communistic or a socialistic thing. It just says make sure you take care of each other. Well, Augustus knew that if he wanted his military to stay with him, he better take care of them. And so he does from his own pocket. Now, two historians by the name of Tacitus and Suetonius both say that Augustus reigned for so long that an entire generation of Romans could not remember a time when he wasn't in power. And I would say that's absolutely true. And so you've probably put the pieces together by now. Augustus is emperor when Jesus is born. And he is mentioned by name in the Bible. Now, Augustus does something that no other consul or dictator had done before. He claims to be divine. In our English language, we attribute divinity and deity as the same. In their world, that wasn't true. We don't really say this very much. My great-grandmother would say this a lot. She would take a bite of chocolate cake and she'll say, "Oh my goodness, this cake is divine." Well, was she saying that the cake was God? No. It was just very, 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 very good. Par excellence. Well, that's the way Augustus saw himself, because he deifies his adopted father, Julius Caesar. So Caesar, when he dies, becomes a god. Augustus then is the son of God. We talked about this when we first started this course with Jesus, with the good confession of Peter, right, with Jesus, and saying, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and what implications that may have had. So Augustus claims to be divine. As divine, he's not claiming to be God. He's claiming to have a relationship with the God, his father, or Julius Caesar. So Augustus, when he is in power, there's an increase in family values and morality. And we talked about this last week with the circumstances. There's an influx of these values. Augustus institutes the Pax Romana. We talked about that last week too, which means Roman peace. It's the end of civil war in Rome. That's not to say Rome doesn't expand by warfare, but it's the end of civil war in Rome. And basically, when you're not worried about dying, what do you focus on? You focus on the things that matter. You focus on your family, on your home life, on your morality. Is there really life after death? And things of philosophy that had long been by the wayside. And so when Augustus is in power, there's peace, and these things rise to the forefront of their mind. So Augustus had three main roles, two of which are held by our president today, because we model our culture, our government, after Rome. Augustus was first and foremost commander-in-chief. He was the leader of the military. Secondly, he was the first citizen. And why do we call the president's wife the first lady or the first family? Because they are the first citizen. And Augustus was the high priest. Now, Roman emperors were by nature the high priest. Most of them didn't exactly take that with much, what's the word I'm looking for? They really didn't care. Right? They performed their duties, they did their rituals, but they really didn't care. They weren't the spiritual leaders of their time. In the same way that Aaron, the high priest of Israel, would have been. Right? Now, that is not to say that religion in Rome was not a big deal. Religion in Rome was a very big deal. And there are several really good videos on YouTube that talk about religion in Rome during the time of the emperors. Because we look at the emperors and we say, oh, well, religion really doesn't have anything to do with that. Well, no, religion was still very much a part of it, just not to the extent that we would think. So Augustus is commander-in-chief, the role that he takes very seriously. He's the first citizen, he's the model citizen, he's the one to whom everyone looks up to, and he is the religious leader. So I'll close with this, and I've got a picture of him on the next slide, so we'll look at him in just a minute. But was Augustus a good or bad leader? Yes. That's pretty much the answer. It's almost like asking, was Samson a good or bad guy? Yeah, depends on what page you're on in Judges, right? Well, he was good because he was a very well-learned and a very astute student. He was elected to the College of Pontiffs at age 16. The College of Pontiffs are the priests. All right, so when he becomes high priest as emperor, he's already been trained for it since he was 16 years old. He was very devout in that. And he was a very bright young student. I think we can make a lot of parallels between Augustus and the Apostle Paul. Because what do we learn in Philippians chapter 3? That Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews, and that he studied, in, I think it's Acts 22, where we find that he studied under Gamaliel. You know, from a very young age, Paul would have been brought up in that religious training. He was a military leader. He learned how to do that because he fought with Julius Caesar in Hispania. He is responsible for the massive building projects and making of the first roads in Rome, and we looked at some pictures of roads last week and just how expansive that project would have been. He is credited with restoring law and order to Rome. You don't have any assassinations during his reign. I think he is the only emperor until Trajan to die of natural causes. Every other emperor is assassinated or exiled. I think I'm right on that. Don't quote me. He is able to then restore the Senate. So he is in the emperorship, but you still have the Senate beside him. The Senate will go by the wayside further on into imperial Rome. What's bad about him? Well, for crying out loud, he started a war. Okay, that's not exactly a good quality to have. So he is one of the causes of civil war. When we look at ancient history and we look at the civil war between Mark Antony and Augustus, we usually blame Mark Antony because Mark Antony came back to Rome with a vengeance. Well, it takes two to tango, and we don't need to forget that. Augustus betrays Mark Antony to increase his power. He keeps control of provinces with the most legions. So let me say something about this really quick. When Augustus is put as emperor, he wins a lot of favor with the Senate because he says, look, I don't want control over all of the empire. I want the Senate to control these provinces, and I'll control these provinces, and when we have something that we need to come together, we can come together. Now that sounds like a very diplomatic approach, unless the provinces that you keep are the richest provinces and the best for military conquest. And so I think he's kind of manipulative here in what he does. And Augustus, much like Julius Caesar, tries to establish a dynasty. He wants his son to carry on with the emperorship, and that's going to continue on. Most every emperor after that is going to want their child to get into the emperorship, and that's not going to happen because, as we said, having children, especially male children, was very difficult for them. So there's a picture of good old Augustus. Again, when you look at these images, don't look at them as a model of a person. Look at them as how the people would have seen them. So I notice right off the bat 3 things about this image. Number 1, dude's got a haircut. When we talk about daily life in Rome, we'll talk about men's hairstyles and women's hairstyles. Men got haircuts. They had slaves whose sole purposes were to be their barbers. You didn't grow a beard, and you had your haircut. When Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that a man should not have long hair, that's very much influenced by the culture, because men in that world did not have long hair. Why? Because women had long hair. And if you had long hair as a man, you were either a male prostitute or a homosexual. So he has a haircut. He has a chiseled jawbone, a very masculine face. And the most important thing that stands out to me is what he's wearing. He's not wearing a toga. You know, he's not wearing the daily clothes or whatever. He's wearing body armor. So he is depicted and forever imaged in stone as a great military leader. I think that's very important as we look at him and what all he did.